1892. A London shopkeeper who sold seashells is about to do the impossible, break the iron grip of the world's richest man. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of the world's oil. His Standard Oil was called the Octopus, its tentacles strangling every competitor who dared challenge it. But Marcus Samuel had a secret weapon, a ship that would change everything. This is the story of how a merchant built an empire from nothing, fought the most powerful monopoly in history, and gave birth to one of the companies that still powers our world today. This is Marcus Samuel versus John D. Rockefeller. In 1890, if you lit a lamp anywhere in the world, chances were John D. Rockefeller got paid. He didn't just sell oil, he owned oil. His company, Standard Oil, controlled roughly 90% of America's oil refining. But that wasn't enough. Rockefeller wanted the whole world. Here's how he did it. Rockefeller didn't just pump oil out of the ground. He controlled the railroads that shipped it. He owned the pipelines that moved it. He ran the refineries that processed it. He had the barrels it was stored in. Every single step from the ground to your lamp, Rockefeller owned a piece of it. Here's why this matters. This is called vertical integration. Instead of just being good at one thing, you control everything. It's like if Netflix also owned the internet cables, the device you watch on, and the electricity powering your house. Good luck competing with that. And Rockefeller played dirty, really dirty. If a competitor tried to ship oil by railroad, Rockefeller would go to the railroad company and say, "Give me a discount or I'll use someone else." The railroads needed Rockefeller more than they needed anyone else, so they'd agree. But here's the genius part. Rockefeller didn't just get a discount for himself. He made the railroads charge his competitors more, sometimes double. Imagine you're selling lemonade for $1, but your competitor next door has to charge $2 because that's what the cup supplier forces them to pay. Who wins? You do. Every time. Rockefeller also had spies, actual industrial spies who'd report on competitors' oil shipments, their customers, their prices. If someone tried to undercut him, he'd find out within days and crush them with a price war, selling oil below cost until the competitor went bankrupt. People called Standard Oil the Octopus because its tentacles reached everywhere. Cross Rockefeller and he'd squeeze until you couldn't breathe. By 1890, Rockefeller was worth about $1.5 billion. That's roughly $500 billion in today's money. Richer than Elon Musk, richer than Jeff Bezos, the richest person in modern history. And he was just getting started on the rest of the world. The shell trader. Now, meet Marcus Samuel. He sold seashells, literally. His father ran a small import business in London's East End, bringing in decorative shells from Asia to sell to Victorian collectors. Marcus took over the family business. Shells, curios, ornamental items. Respectable, modest, nothing glamorous. But Marcus had been traveling to Asia since he was a young man, and he'd noticed something. Asia was exploding with growth. Japan was industrializing. China's ports were opening up. India was developing, and all these places needed one thing desperately: light. In the 1900s, electricity was still rare. Most of the world lit their homes with kerosene lamps, and kerosene came from oil. Here's the opportunity Marcus saw. Standard Oil was shipping kerosene to Asia, but they were doing it the old way, in barrels. Thousands of barrels loaded onto regular cargo ships, sailing all the way around Africa because the Suez Canal wouldn't allow ships carrying bulk oil, fire risk. The journey took months, it was expensive, it was inefficient.
Marcus thought, what if I could ship oil in bulk? What if I could use the Suez Canal and cut the journey by 4,000 miles? What if I could deliver kerosene to Asia cheaper and faster than Rockefeller? It was an insane idea. Marcus wasn't an oil man. He had no refineries, no oil wells, no experience in the industry. He was a shell merchant going up against the most powerful businessman in the world. But he had one advantage Rockefeller didn't. He knew Asia. He had relationships there. He understood those markets in a way Rockefeller's people, sitting in New York, never could. Here's why this matters. This is the classic outsider advantage. Sometimes the biggest innovations come from people outside an industry because they're not stuck thinking this is how we've always done it. Samuel saw the inefficiency because he wasn't blinded by Standard Oil's playbook. Let's be clear about what was on the table. The Asian kerosene market was worth millions, eventually tens of millions of dollars annually. Japan alone was importing millions of gallons. This wasn't a side business. This was empire-building money. Rockefeller wanted it. Samuel wanted it. Only one of them could have it. And here's the thing about fighting Rockefeller. Everyone who'd tried had lost, spectacularly. He'd bankrupted competitors, driven them to suicide, forced them to sell to him for pennies on the dollar. The smart money said Marcus Samuel would be next. But Marcus wasn't planning to fight Rockefeller head-on. He was planning something Rockefeller would never see coming. First, Marcus needed oil. He couldn't use American oil. That was Rockefeller's turf. But there was another source, Russia. In the 1880s, oil had been discovered around Baku, near the Caspian Sea, Russian oil, and it was controlled by the Rothschild family. Yes, those Rothschilds, the European banking dynasty. The Rothschilds wanted to sell their oil to Asia, but they had the same problem. How do you get it there efficiently? Marcus approached them with a deal. I'll build the ships and the distribution network. You supply the oil. We split the profits. The Rothschilds agreed. Here's why this matters. When you can't compete on supply, find a different supplier. Rockefeller controlled American oil, but he didn't control Russian oil. Samuel found the gap in the monopoly. Now came the hard part, the ships. Samuel commissioned a new type of vessel, a bulk oil tanker that could carry oil in its hull instead of in barrels. This had been tried before and mostly failed. Oil was dangerous. It was flammable. Ships had caught fire, exploded, sunk. But Samuel worked with engineers to solve the safety problems. Double hulls, ventilation systems, safety valves. And most importantly, he convinced the Suez Canal Authority to let his ships through. This was huge. The Suez Canal cut the journey from Russia to Asia from about 12,000 miles around Africa to 8,000 miles through Suez. That meant faster delivery, lower costs, fresher oil. In July 1892, the first tanker, named the Murex after a type of shell, made the journey. It carried 4,000 tons of kerosene from the Black Sea through the Suez Canal to Singapore and Bangkok. Let's do the math on why this mattered. The old way, Standard Oil, ship barrels around Africa, about 12,000 miles. Time, 3 to 4 months. Cost, high labor, loading and unloading thousands of barrels, high shipping fees, high losses, barrels leak, break, get stolen, approximately $0.10 to $0.15 per gallon in shipping costs. Samuel's way, bulk tanker through Suez, about 8,000 miles. Time, 6 to 8 weeks. Cost, 1/3 fewer miles, no barrels needed, faster turnaround. Approximately $0.05 to $0.07 per gallon. That difference, 5 to 8 cents per gallon, doesn't sound like much, but multiply it by millions of gallons and you're talking about millions of dollars in savings. Samuel could undercut Rockefeller's prices in Asia and still make a profit. Here's why this matters. In business, small efficiencies at scale become massive advantages. Amazon saves pennies per package on shipping. Multiply by billions of packages, and you've built an empire. Samuel did the same thing 100 years earlier, building the network. But Samuel didn't stop at ships. He knew that to really compete, he needed infrastructure on the ground in Asia. Between 1892 and 1895, he built storage tanks in Singapore, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Yokohama. Distribution partnerships with local merchants. Filling stations where customers could buy kerosene directly. A fleet of smaller vessels to move oil from main ports to secondary cities. This was expensive, really expensive. Samuel was borrowing heavily from London banks, betting his entire fortune and his family's future on this network. Think about it. He's building massive storage facilities in countries thousands of miles away, in markets he doesn't fully control, competing against the richest man in the world who could crush him at any moment. Why would banks lend him this money? Because Samuel was smart about relationships. He brought in partners, British trading houses that already operated in Asia. He offered them stakes in the business. He spread the risk, and he showed them the math. We can deliver kerosene cheaper than Standard Oil, so we'll win the customers. It worked. By 1895, Samuel had a functioning network across Asia. Ships arriving weekly, storage tanks full, customers switching from Standard Oil's expensive kerosene to Samuel's cheaper product. He even created a brand. He called his company Shell Transport and Trading Company, named after his father's shell business. The logo? A shell. Simple, memorable, different from anything else in oil. Here's why this matters. Brand matters, even in commodities. Oil is oil, right? Wrong. Samuel made his oil feel premium, reliable, connected to Asian markets. That perception became worth millions. By 1895, Standard Oil's intelligence network had figured out what was happening. Some British merchant was undercutting them in Asia. Shipments were being lost to this shell company. Profits were down. Rockefeller's team investigated. When they realized the scale of what Samuel had built, they understood this wasn't some small competitor. This was a genuine threat. And Rockefeller didn't tolerate threats. The war was about to begin. Rockefeller's response was classic monopoly playbook. If you can't beat them on efficiency, beat them on price. In 1896, Standard Oil slashed prices in Asia dramatically. They started selling kerosene below cost. In some markets, they were losing money on every gallon just to match or undercut Samuel's prices. Why would they do this? Because they could afford it. Standard Oil was making enormous profits in America and Europe. They could lose money in Asia for years if necessary. Their goal wasn't to make money in Asia right now. It was to bleed Samuel dry until he couldn't afford to continue. Here's why this matters. This is called predatory pricing, and it's how monopolies crush competition. You use profits from one market to subsidize losses in another until your competitor runs out of money. It's brutal, often illegal today, but perfectly legal in the 1890s. Samuel was in trouble. He'd borrowed heavily to build his network. He needed revenue to pay back those loans. If Rockefeller could keep prices low long enough, Samuel's creditors would panic and demand repayment. Samuel would be forced to sell or shut down. But Samuel didn't fold. Instead, he doubled down. He ordered more ships. He expanded his storage network. He made even more deals with local distributors. His bet? Rockefeller can't sustain losses forever. Eventually, Standard Oil's shareholders will demand profits. I just have to survive until then. It was a war of attrition. Who could bleed longer?
Samuel also tried something clever. He competed on quality, not just price. Russian oil from Baku was actually cleaner than some American oil. It burned brighter, produced less smoke, smelled better. Samuel marketed this heavily in Asia. Standard Oil might be cheaper this week, his salesman would say, but our kerosene is better. It won't ruin your lamps. It won't make your home smell. Did it work? Sometimes. In wealthier markets like Japan, quality mattered. Customers were willing to pay a little more for better kerosene. But in poorer markets, rural China, India, price was everything. And there, Rockefeller was winning. Here's why this matters. When you're fighting a price war, differentiation is your friend. Apple doesn't try to be the cheapest phone, they try to be the best. Samuel was attempting the same strategy, but in markets where most people couldn't afford to care about best. Rockefeller's tactics went beyond pricing. Standard Oil representatives in Asia spread rumors about Samuel's company. Shell Oil is dangerous, their ships are unsafe, they're going to go bankrupt any day now. They tried to bribe Samuel's distributors to switch back to Standard Oil. They attempted to block Samuel's access to ports by leveraging relationships with colonial authorities. There were even reports, never fully confirmed, of sabotage, storage tanks mysteriously catching fire, shipments being lost. This was corporate warfare, 1890s style. No rules, no oversight, just survival.
Samuel fought back with his own intelligence network. He had people in Standard Oil's Asian offices reporting on their strategies. He built relationships with British colonial administrators to counter Standard Oil's influence. It was exhausting, expensive, brutal. Then, in 1901, something happened that changed everything. Spindletop. A massive oil discovery in Texas, the biggest gusher anyone had ever seen. Suddenly, American oil production exploded. This was bad news for Rockefeller. More supply meant lower prices and more competition in America. But it was also complicated for Samuel. More cheap American oil meant Standard Oil could potentially drop prices even further in Asia. The landscape was shifting, fast. Here's why this matters. External shocks can reshape entire industries overnight. Samuel and Rockefeller were fighting over Russian versus American oil, and suddenly there's exponentially more American oil than anyone predicted. All their calculations had to change. By 1905, both sides were exhausted. Samuel had spent millions building his empire. He'd survived Rockefeller's onslaught, but barely. His company was profitable, but not hugely so. The constant price wars kept margins thin. Rockefeller had failed to crush Samuel, but he'd prevented him from dominating Asia. Standard Oil still held significant market share. Neither side had won. Both had bled. And there was a third player entering the game, Royal Dutch Petroleum, a Dutch company operating in the East Indies, modern Indonesia. They had their own oil supply, their own distribution, and their own ambitions. Now it was a three-way fight, and none of them could afford it anymore. Something had to give. By 1906, Marcus Samuel was facing a harsh reality. He'd built something incredible, but he couldn't sustain it alone. Here's what was going wrong. Overextension. Samuel had expanded into too many markets too fast. He was operating in Japan, China, India, Southeast Asia, and trying to break into Australia. Each market required investment, infrastructure, local expertise. He was stretched thin. Family business limits. Shell was still largely a family-run business. That meant limited access to capital compared to publicly traded giants. When Samuel needed more money, he had to borrow or convince partners to invest. He couldn't just issue stock like bigger corporations. The Borneo disaster. Samuel had invested heavily in oil exploration in Borneo, modern-day Malaysia, Indonesia, hoping to find his own oil supply and stop depending on the Rothschilds' Russian oil. The exploration mostly failed. Millions of pounds lost. Management strain. Samuel was brilliant at vision and strategy, but running a global oil company required professional managers, systems, processes. Shell was growing faster than Samuel could build that infrastructure. The math was becoming impossible. Shell was profitable, but not profitable enough to keep fighting both Standard Oil and Royal Dutch, and fund continued expansion and pay back loans. Samuel needed help.
Royal Dutch Petroleum was run by a man named Henri Detterding, a Dutch businessman who was just as ambitious and ruthless as Rockefeller, but younger and hungrier. Detterding had been watching Samuel's fight with Rockefeller with great interest. He saw an opportunity. In 1903, Detterding approached Samuel with an idea. What if we stop competing and start cooperating? Think about it, Detterding argued. Royal Dutch has oil supplies in the East Indies, close to Asian markets, no need to ship from Russia or America. Shell has the distribution network, the ships, the storage tanks, the customers. Together, we'd be unstoppable. Samuel was hesitant. He'd built Shell from nothing. It was his creation, his legacy. Sharing control felt like failure. But the economics were undeniable. Here's the math. Option A. Keep fighting. Shell spending millions annually competing with both Standard Oil and Royal Dutch. Profit margins squeezed by constant price wars. Risk of bankruptcy if one more thing goes wrong. Limited growth potential without more capital. Option B. Merge with Royal Dutch. Combined company eliminates one major competitor. Royal Dutch Oil plus Shell distribution equals massive cost savings.
access to Royal Dutch's capital and political connections in the East Indies, shared costs, shared risks, shared profits. Here's why this matters. Sometimes the best business decision is admitting you can't win alone. Uber and Didi fought a brutal war in China before realizing cooperation was smarter than mutual destruction. Samuel faced the same calculation. After years of negotiations, Shell Transport and Trading Company merged with Royal Dutch Petroleum in 1907. But here's the catch: it wasn't an equal merger. The deal was 60% Royal Dutch, 40% Shell. Detterding would run the combined company. Samuel would have a seat on the board, but he wouldn't be in charge anymore. Samuel had built Shell, fought Rockefeller, survived impossible odds, and now he was handing control to someone else. It must have been crushing. But Samuel was also pragmatic. He was in his 50s, tired from 15 years of brutal competition. His family would be wealthy. Shell would survive. And together with Royal Dutch, they'd finally have the scale to truly compete with Standard Oil globally. The new company was called Royal Dutch Shell. Today, you know it simply as Shell, one of the largest oil companies in the world. Here's why this matters. Ego kills companies. Samuel could have refused, insisted on control, and probably watched Shell slowly fail. Instead, he accepted reality. He took the deal that ensured his creation would outlive him, even if he wouldn't run it.
Ironically, while Samuel was negotiating his merger, Rockefeller was facing his own existential crisis, but from a different direction. The U.S. government had been investigating Standard Oil for years. Journalists called muckrakers were writing exposés on Rockefeller's monopolistic practices. Public opinion was turning against him. In 1906, the federal government filed an antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil, accusing them of illegal monopoly practices. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Rockefeller. Standard Oil was ordered to break up into 34 separate companies. The octopus was being torn apart. The companies that emerged from that breakup? ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others, still giants today, but no longer one unified monopoly. So here's the irony. Samuel had to merge to survive. Rockefeller was forced to split apart. Both lost control of their original creations, but both had shaped the world. Let's be clear about what Marcus Samuel accomplished. 1. He broke the unbreakable monopoly. Before Samuel, Rockefeller seemed invincible. Samuel proved he could be challenged. He showed that innovation and strategy could counter raw power and capital. 2. He pioneered modern oil logistics. The bulk tanker system Samuel developed became the industry standard. Today, virtually all oil moves on tankers, not in barrels. Samuel invented that. 3. He established permanent competition. Shell didn't just survive, it thrived. For over a century, Shell has been one of the top oil companies in the world, a direct competitor to Rockefeller's descendants, Exxon, Chevron. Samuel created lasting competition in global energy markets. 4. He built from nothing. Remember, Samuel started as a shell merchant. He had no oil industry experience, no family oil wealth, no connections in the business. He learned, adapted, and built an empire anyway. That's extraordinary. But let's also be honest about the price. 1. He lost control of his company. By 1907, Samuel was no longer running Shell. Detterding was. Samuel had a title and a board seat, but Shell wasn't his anymore. 2. Enormous stress. Samuel's health suffered. The constant battles, the financial pressure, the years of warfare with Rockefeller, it took a toll. He wasn't a young man when it was over. 3. He never achieved Rockefeller's wealth or fame. Samuel became wealthy, but not Rockefeller-level wealthy. And while Rockefeller became one of the most famous men in the world, Samuel remained relatively unknown. Ask people today who founded Shell, and most won't know. 4. The Borneo losses. Samuel bet heavily on finding his own oil supply and lost millions when it didn't pan out. Those failures haunted him. Here's why this matters.
Success isn't always total victory. Samuel didn't beat Rockefeller in the traditional sense. He didn't become richer or more famous, but he built something that lasted. Sometimes that's enough. Samuel's battle with Rockefeller had ripple effects far beyond their two companies. One, it globalized oil markets. Before Samuel, oil was largely an American story. After Samuel, oil became a global commodity. Asian markets mattered. Russian oil mattered. The Middle East would soon matter. Samuel helped make oil a worldwide industry. 2. It proved infrastructure beats inventory. Samuel didn't win by having more oil than Rockefeller. He won by moving oil better than Rockefeller. Control distribution, control the market. Amazon learned this 100 years later. 3. It showed monopolies could fall. Standard Oil seemed permanent, unstoppable. Samuel chipped away at it. Then others joined. Then governments intervened. By 1911, the monopoly was broken. Samuel started that process. 4. It established the modern energy landscape. The companies born from this era, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, still dominate global energy. The competition Samuel ignited never stopped.
What can we learn from this story for modern business and investing? Lesson 1. Innovation beats capital. Sometimes. Rockefeller had more money, more resources, more power, but Samuel had a better idea: bulk tankers through Suez. That innovation leveled the playing field. Modern parallel? Tesla didn't have the capital of Ford or GM, but they innovated on electric vehicles and forced the entire industry to change. Lesson 2. Know when to fight and when to merge. Samuel fought Rockefeller for over a decade, but when it became unsustainable, he merged with Royal Dutch. Pride didn't stop him from making the smart financial decision. Modern parallel? Uber fought Didi in China for years, burning billions. Eventually, they realized cooperation was smarter. Uber sold its China operations to Didi in exchange for a stake. Lesson 3. Monopolies are vulnerable at the edges. Rockefeller controlled America. Samuel didn't fight him there. Samuel went to Asia, somewhere Rockefeller was weaker. Find the gap, exploit it. Modern parallel, Google dominates search in the West. TikTok didn't try to beat Google at search. They created a new category, short-form video discovery, where Google was weak. Lesson 4. Distribution is destiny. Samuel understood that controlling how oil reached customers was more valuable than just having oil. Whoever controls distribution controls the customer relationship. Modern parallel? Netflix realized this early. They didn't just license content, they built the distribution platform. Now they control the customer, the data, the experience. Infrastructure takes time and money, but it's a moat. Samuel spent years and millions building storage tanks, ports, ships, distribution networks. It was expensive and slow, but once built, it was hard for competitors to replicate. Modern parallel? Amazon's warehouse and logistics network took decades and tens of billions to build. Now it's one of the most valuable moats in business. Modern parallels, big tech and their challengers. The Samuel versus Rockefeller story feels familiar because it's happening again, right now. Google, the Rockefeller, versus OpenAI, ChatGPT, the Samuel. Google dominated search for 20 years, seemed unbeatable. OpenAI didn't have Google's resources, data, or infrastructure, but they innovated on AI-powered answers, creating a new category. Now Google is scrambling to respond. Amazon, the Rockefeller, versus Shopify, the Samuel. Amazon dominates e-commerce, controls distribution. Shopify couldn't beat Amazon at their own game. Instead, they empowered small merchants to compete with Amazon. Built infrastructure, payments, logistics, storefronts that merchants control.
Spotify, Apple Music, the Rockefeller versus indie artists, Bandcamp, the Samuel. Streaming giants control music distribution. Indie artists can't compete on scale, but they're finding new models, direct fan funding, NFTs, community platforms, challenging the assumption that you need massive distribution to succeed. The pattern repeats: dominant player, innovative challenger, battle over distribution and markets, eventual equilibrium, sometimes through merger, sometimes through government intervention, sometimes through market evolution. So, was Marcus Samuel versus John D. Rockefeller a David and Goliath story? Yes, but with a twist. David didn't kill Goliath. Samuel didn't destroy Rockefeller. Standard Oil was eventually broken up, but not by Samuel. What Samuel did was prove Goliath could bleed. He showed that innovation could challenge monopoly power, that efficiency could compete with scale, that a determined outsider with a better idea could force the most powerful businessman in history to take him seriously. Rockefeller never conquered Asia the way he conquered America, largely because Samuel got there first and built barriers Rockefeller couldn't easily cross. And Shell? It's still here, over 100 years later, one of the top 5 oil companies in the world, operating in more than 70 countries, employing over 80,000 people. Not bad for a guy who started by selling seashells. Here's the final lesson. In business, you don't have to destroy the giant to win. You just have to build something that survives the giant's attempts to destroy you. Samuel built Shell to outlast him. It did. Rockefeller built Standard Oil to outlast him. It didn't, at least not in its original form. The Shell merchant beat the richest man in the world by playing a longer game. And that's the real David and Goliath story. Not about one dramatic victory, but about persistence, innovation, and building something bigger than yourself. Samuel didn't win every battle, but he won the war that mattered, the war for legacy. Shell still powers the world, and we still remember the man who had the audacity to think a shell merchant could challenge an empire.